this video, we're going to be looking at Thomas Carlyle's text, Sartor Resartus, which is an often confusing text and an odd mixture of an autobiography, since Carlyle displaces some of his own experiences onto Teufelsdreck, and Teufelsdreck becomes the alter ego of Carlyle in expressing Carlyle's closed philosophy and his various social philosophies. And then in addition to the autobiography, we have the sort of philosophical novel in which the editor is telling the story of Teufelsdreck. And then on top of that, we have Carlyle's philosophical treatise in which he is, through Teufelsdreck, examining the problems of his society and proposing answers for how those problems need to be addressed. And also it's confusing because of the somewhat overblown rhetoric that Carlyle often employs. And thirdly, it's confusing because there's a mixture of two separate voices in the text. On the one hand, we have the voice of the editor, the sort of stodgy British editor who's fanboying over Teufelsdreck. And the other voice is the voice of Teufelsdreck himself, who is being quoted in the text. The pretense of this text is that this somewhat stodgy English editor has found these various notes scribbled by Diogenes Teufelsdreck and is recompiling them, stitching them together into a coherent narrative. And so the mixture of the two voices is a result of the editor expressing his opinions and then including the quotations that he takes from Teufelsdreck. So those things that are in quotation marks are Teufelsdreck's, and those things that are outside of quotation marks and those things talking about our philosopher, that's the voice of the editor in this text. The title of the text is Sartor Resartus, and Sartor Resartus translates from Latin as the tailor retailored, and that title is appropriate for this text in two ways. The first way it's appropriate is because Diogenes Teufelsdreck, the fictional alter ego of Carlyle, is the tailor who has constructed, stitched together, if you will, a clothes philosophy, a philosophy of clothes as a metaphor for the relationship between the incorporeal, transcendental world and the physical, actual world in which we live and which we experience directly. And so he's the tailor, metaphorically, who has put together, stitched together this clothes philosophy. And then the tailor is being retailored by this editor who is compiling these various notes into a coherent narrative explaining not only the clothes philosophy, but the experiences that have led him to formulate this philosophy. Now, the text itself is actually quite long. We're looking at two chapters that are almost in the center of this text, during which Teufelsdreck is experiencing a profound depression, primarily because the woman he loves, Blumine, whom he courted but who was forbidden to see him, has married his rival, and he has now abandoned his home and is wandering through Europe trying to find the meaning of it all. And so in these sections, in The Everlasting No, we see him grappling with his depression and the resulting nihilistic attitudes that have been tormenting him. In The Center of Indifference, he's managed to reject the nihilism, but hasn't found anything positive to affirm. And then in The Everlasting Yea, he finally makes a positive affirmation, which is, ironically, one of renunciation. His positive move is to renounce. And we'll be looking at this progression from nihilism to indifference to ultimately renunciation in favor of serving other people. And as we go through this, I want you to keep careful track of his progress through these attitudes, because we will be contrasting them with the attitudes of John Stuart Mill in his autobiography, and looking at the ways that John Stuart Mill himself has managed to go through the depression that resulted in the rejection of his previous beliefs and finally end up with a more positive attitude which allows him to function again. We are going to start looking at Sartor Resartus at a later chapter, near the middle of the text, called The Everlasting No. And what has happened before this in the text is we've traced the growth of Diogenes Teufelsdreck from a young boy up to a young man. And most recently, what's happened is that he has fallen in love with a beautiful young woman whose name is Blumine. And although she has given him some indication that she loves him too, tells him that she is unable to meet him anymore, that for some reason, he doesn't know why, she is denied to him. And then he, in despair, goes on a tour, and he's walking down a road through the mountains, and a carriage goes by, and it turns out that it's a wedding carriage of a young couple on their honeymoon, and it turns out to be his beloved Blumine in the carriage with his best friend Togud. And he now feels betrayed not only by Blumine, but by his friend. And in that depression, we enter the beginning of the Everlasting No. Now, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time looking at Teufelsdreck's sorrows and problems here, but rather the opportunities that Carlyle uses in order to talk about the philosophy that he's trying to advance. So the first one we're going to look at is if you skip down to page 35, the second page of the section, we have the editor. Now remember, I mentioned that there are two separate voices here. There is one voice that belongs to the editor who is piecing together these various documents that he has somehow come upon from Teufelsdreck, and that voice is here. And then when we have quotation marks, this is Teufelsdreck's writing. And so we're looking at the editor and Teufelsdreck. And Teufelsdreck is dealing with the loss of faith in humankind and the cosmos that he suffered as a result of the betrayal of his beloved. But at the same time, he's unwilling to give in to total materialism, the belief that there is only material reality that matters and that there is nothing beyond material reality. And so we hear this depressed man looking for some meaning, but not being able to find it. He says, full of religion, or at least of religiosity, and remember that Carlyle himself has lost his faith, but still believes that there is something out there greater than him, some sort of God stuff. As our friend, that would be Teufelsdreck, has since exhibited himself, he hides not that in those days he was wholly irreligious. Doubt had darkened into unbelief, says he. Shade after shade goes grimly over your soul until you have the fixed, starless Tartarian black. To such readers as reflected, what can be called reflecting on man's life, and happily discovered in contradiction to much profit and loss philosophy, speculative and practical, that soul is not synonymous with stomach, who understand therefore in our friend's words that for man's well-being faith is properly the one thing needful, how with it martyrs otherwise weak can cheerfully endure the shame and the cross, and without it worldlings puke up their sick existence by suicide in the midst of luxury. To such it will be clear that for a pure moral nature the loss of his religious belief was the loss of everything. Unhappy young man, all wounds, the crush of long-continued destitution, the stab of false friendship and of false love, all wounds in thy so genial heart would have healed again had not its life warmth been withdrawn. This is the reference here to utilitarian philosophy, profit and loss philosophy. Teufelsdreck and Carlyle are referring to utilitarianism. Profit and loss philosophy is a reference to utilitarianism, and its idea in Benthamite utilitarianism that humans search for physical pleasure is represented in the idea that soul is synonymous with stomach. The idea that we are all seeking merely physical pleasure, in this case the physical pleasure of eating well. Our only motivation, our only soul, is the search for this physical satisfaction. And Teufelsdreck is unwilling to give in to this profit and loss materialist philosophy, but nevertheless his disappointment is leading him toward a sort of nihilism. If we scroll down a bit further, he continues his tack on utilitarianism. Foolish wordmonger and motive grinder, who in thy logic mill hast an earthly mechanism for the godlike itself, and wouldst fain grind me out virtue from the husks of pleasure. And again, this is a reference to Jeremy Bentham's utilitarianism, as the footnote says. I tell thee nay, to the unregenerate Prometheus Vinctus of a man it is ever the bitterest aggravation of his wretchedness that he is conscious of virtue, that he feels himself the victim of not suffering only, but of injustice. What then is the heroic inspiration we name virtue but some passion, some bubble of the blood, bubbling in the direction others profit by? I know not. Only this I know. If what thou namest happiness be our true aim, then we are all astray. With stupidity and sound digestion man may front much. But what, in these dull, unimaginative days, are the terrors of conscience to the diseases of the liver? Not on morality, but on cookery let us build our stronghold. There, brandishing our frying pan as censer, let us offer the sweet incense to the devil, and live at ease on the fat things he has provided for his elect. So this bit here is satirical. Clearly, Teufelsdreck and Carlyle are rejecting the idea that all we are seeking for is material pleasure, that there's only material reality, that there's nothing there. And the reason he's suggesting this is that he says, with stupidity and sound digestion, a man may front much. So a stupid person who's eating well is therefore the happiest of humans. And as a result of that, instead of worrying about conscience, instead of worrying about the absolute standards of right and wrong that come from the transcendental realm, we should be worrying about cirrhosis of the liver coming from drinking too much. That's our only morality. Not on morality, but on cookery let us build our stronghold. And this is the satirical portion of it, that cookery, not morality, becomes the basis of our behavior. And brandishing our frying pan as a censer, is one of those things that they use in church that they put incense on and they swing it around, casting incense on the congregation. Let us offer sweet incense to the devil and live at ease on the fat things he has provided for his elect. So Teufelsdreck is verging on nihilism, but unable to accept utilitarianism and materialism as his creed, and he's looking for something else. Farther down on page 37, he foreshadows the recognition that ultimately will come fully out later on, 2 chapters later, in the Everlasting Yea, which is the doctrine of work. And since he doesn't really know what to do, Teufelsdreck comes to the conclusion that the only thing one can do is to do something. He says, between vague, wavering capability and fixed, indubitable performance, what a difference. A certain inarticulate self-consciousness dwells dimly in us, which only our works can render articulate and decisively discernible. Our works are the mirror wherein the spirit first sees its natural lineaments. Hence, too, the folly of that impossible precept, know thyself, till it be translated into this partially possible one, know what thou canst work at. The idea is that sitting around doing nothing not only doesn't produce anything, but ultimately it doesn't lead to any knowledge. The only way to gain knowledge is to actually try to do something. And this is the beginning of Teufelsdreck's and Carlyle's idea of work as the clothing which manifests the transcendental realm into the real world. Of course, Teufelsdreck's crisis of faith comes from the fact that although he has tried to do things, the results of his efforts have been nothing. And by the way, you should be paying careful attention to this discussion when you get to Mill, because it's very similar to Mill talking about his contemplation of what would happen were all of his goals to be instantly realized. Would he be happy? And his recognition that he would not. So Teufelsdreck is dealing with this loss of faith, not only in the universe, but in himself. And that loss of faith has led him to the beginnings of this nihilistic attitude. Nihilism is the idea that there is nothing, nothing matters. At the bottom of the page he says, to me, the universe was all void of life, of purpose, of volition, even of hostility. It was one dead, immeasurable steam engine rolling on in its dead indifference to grind me limb from limb. O vast, gloomy, solitary Golgotha and mill of death! Why was the living banished thither, companionless, conscious? Why, if there is no devil, nay, unless the devil is your God? And so this is the beginnings of his nihilistic attitude, which is weighting him down. Teufelsdreck, reflecting Carlyle's own real psychological crisis, which has now been displaced onto his fictional character, abandoned by his beloved and betrayed by his best friend, has now been tempted to surrender to a nihilistic attitude, to believe that the universe is a meaningless engine of death with no spiritual value. However, at the end of the Everlasting No chapter, on page 38, Teufelsdreck comes to the realization that something must matter, and therefore determines to reject Everlasting No, to reject the nihilistic attitude that denies meaning to the universe. He says at the bottom of page 38, and yet, strangely enough, I lived in a continual indefinite pining fear, tremulous, pusillanimous, apprehensive of I knew not what. It seemed as if all things in the heavens above and the earth beneath would hurt me, as if the heavens and the earth were but boundless jaws of a devouring monster, wherein I, palpitating, waited to be devoured. Full of such humor, and perhaps the miserablest man in the whole French capital or suburbs, was I one sultry dog day, after much perambulation, toiling on the dirty little Rue Saint-Thomas de l'Enfer, among civic rubbish enough, in a close atmosphere, and over pavements hot as Nebuchadnezzar's furnace,
whereby doubtless my spirits were little cheered, when all at once there rose a thought in me, and I asked myself, what art thou afraid of? Wherefore, like a coward, dost thou forever pip and whimper, and go cowering and trembling, despicable biped? What is the sum total of the worst that lies before thee? Death? Well, death, and say the pangs of Tophet too, and all that devil and man may, will, or can do against thee. Hast thou not a heart, and canst thou not suffer whatsoever it be? And as a child of freedom, thou outcast, trample Tophet itself under thy feet, while it consumes thee? Let it come then, I will meet it, and defy it. And as I so thought, there rushed like a stream of fire over my whole soul, and I shook base fear away from me forever. I was strong of an unknown strength, a spirit, almost a god. Ever from that time the temper of my misery was changed. Not fear or whining sorrow was it, but indignation and grim fire-eyed defiance. Thus had the everlasting No pealed authoritatively through all my recesses of my being, of my me, and then was it that my whole me stood up in native God-creative majesty, and with emphasis recorded its protest. Such a protest, the most important transaction in life, may that same indignation and defiance in a psychological point of view be fitly called. The everlasting No had said, behold, thou art fatherless, outcast, and the universe is mine, the devil's. To which my whole me now made answer, I am not thine, but free and forever hate thee. It is from this hour I incline to date my spiritual new birth, or Baphometic fire baptism. Perhaps I directly thereupon began to be a man. And so, in this particular case, Teufelsdreck, channeling Carlyle, is describing his state of depression bordering on nihilism and rejection of any meaning whatsoever. And walking down the street of St. Thomas the Doubter. Remember, St. Thomas the Doubter is the apostle who doubted Jesus' divinity. So he's become the patron saint of cynics and skeptics. And simply decides that he's had enough. That he can't live in this pusillanimous, apprehensive, tremulous, pining fear. And determines that he is going to reject the nihilism. And the nihilism in this case is everlasting No. The nihilism is the rejection of all meaning. And he is rejecting the rejection. He's rejecting the everlasting No. He's making a negative affirmation by rejecting negativity. And this is what he calls his spiritual new birth, or Baphometic fire baptism. Once again, Carlyle is indulging in his desire for neologisms and making up terms. And so this is the first step in his progress toward some sort of positive statement. The first step in the progress toward some sort of positive affirmation is to reject nihilism. But the next step after that is to come to something positive to say, or some direction for action. Because although you leave behind the idea that nothing matters, you now have to determine that something does matter, and you have to determine what that thing is that matters. The next chapter, The Center of Indifference, he is in between the rejection of nothingness, but he hasn't yet come to any affirmation or positive statement, and so he's in this state of indifference. And we are going to scroll through The Center of Indifference down to the next chapter, The Everlasting Yea, and specifically page 49 of The Everlasting Yea, where Teufelsdreck comes to some sort of positive affirmative belief. He comes to this belief by considering why humans are unhappy. Now, I actually think this passage is a really important one in Victorian literature and probably in human psychology in general, because I think it explains why people in a consumer society, even our own modern consumer society, and especially in a world where we so easily can compare ourselves to others using instantaneous images on social media, it explains why people seem to be so often unhappy. And here's his explanation, at the bottom of page 49. Man's unhappiness, as I construe, comes of his greatness. It is because there is an infinite in him, which all his cunning he cannot quite bury under the finite. So in other words, we have some innate sense in us of something greater than simply what we currently have, and we're seeking that. And so he's going to try to offer an example of that. He says, will the whole finance ministers and upholsterers and confections of modern Europe undertake in a joint stock company to make one shoeblack happy? A shoeblack is a shoeshine person, and this would be the very bottom of the social pyramid, right? Someone who works in the streets and collects dimes for shining people's shoes. And so he imagines that all of the people with all of the money and all of the people who make the furniture and all the people who make the candy got together and formed a single corporation with the intent and purpose of making one person at the very bottom of the social scale happy. And he says, they cannot accomplish it above an hour or two, for the shoeblack also has a soul quite other than his stomach. Remember, this is a reference to Carlyle's characterization of utilitarianism as is replacing our soul with our stomach, replacing a desire for something greater with simply a desire for pleasure, and would require, if you consider it, for his permanent satisfaction and saturation, simply this allotment and no more and no less. God's infinite universe altogether to himself, therein to enjoy infinitely and fill every wish as fast as it arose. Oceans of Hockheimer. Hockheimer is a particularly fine German beer. A throat like that of Ophiuchus. Speak not of them. To the infinite shoeblack there is nothing. No sooner is your ocean filled than he grumbles that it might have been of better vintage. Try him with half the universe. Of an omnipotence he sets to quarreling with the proprietor of the other half and declares himself the most maltreated of men. Always there is a black spot in our sunshine. It is, even as I said, the shadow of ourselves. And so his account for why we become unhappy is that we have this desire in us for something more, always. That there's some innate desire for something more. And if you were to form a joint stock company to make a shoeblack happy, and you gave him half the universe and made him omnipotent in that half, before long he'd be looking at the other half of the universe and going, well, that half is nicer than mine. I want that half too. And the problem we run into when we determine what it would take to make us happy is, as he says here, the shadow of ourselves. And he's going to describe how the shadow of ourselves gets in the way of our happiness in the next paragraph. And keep in mind how this actually works in our own contemporary society, and especially how, for instance, it's preyed on by things like advertising. But the whim we have of happiness is somewhat thus. By certain valuations and averages of our own striking, we come upon some sort of average terrestrial lot. This we fancy belongs to us by nature and of indefeasible right. It is simple payment of our wages, of our deserts, requires neither thanks nor complaint. Only such overplus as there may be do we account happiness. Any deficit again is misery. What he's saying is, we look around us and see people who we determine are somewhat like ourselves, people of our own station in life. We look across our neighborhood, for instance, and people in a neighborhood occupy houses that cost roughly the same as our house cost, and they drive cars roughly the same as our cars cost. And we look around and say, this is normal. This is what a normal person has. This is what I get by right. This is just what I am due, what I am owed by the universe. That's normal. Only more than this would we count happiness, and any less than this we would be unhappy. So if you look around the neighborhood and you see that all your neighbors drive Hondas and Toyotas and you drive a BMW, you think, wow, I've got a nicer car. That's good. But if you look around the neighborhood and all your neighbors are driving BMWs and Mercedes and you're driving an old beat up Ford Fiesta, you go, wow, I should have a Mercedes or a BMW. Wow, I am so abused. So that's how we determine what we get, what we deserve. Anything more than we deserve is what makes us happy. Then he goes on to say, now consider that we have the valuation of our own deserts ourselves, and what a fund of self-conceit there is in each of us. Do you wonder that the balance should so often dip the wrong way, and many a blockhead cry, see what a payment, was ever a worthy gentleman so used? I tell thee, blockhead, it comes of thy vanity, of what thou fanciest those same deserts of thine to be. So the problem is that we all have a sense of what we deserve that's greater than what we actually do deserve. That we get to determine ourselves what we deserve. We get to look around and determine ourselves what's normal. And so we always set that expectation of what we deserve at higher than we actually have. And so we're always making ourselves unhappy by creating expectations beyond what we deserve. And his answer to this is that fancy that thou deservest to be hanged, as is most likely, thou wilt feel it a happiness to be only shot. Fancy that thou deservest to be hanged in a hair halter, it will be a luxury to die in a hemp. Hair rope is very uncomfortable, a hemp rope is much softer and more comfortable, and if you're going to be hanged anyway, then dying in a comfortable rope will make you happier than dying in an uncomfortable rope. If you think you're going to be hanged, then being shot is better, and you should be happy about that. So what you end up doing is if you set your expectations lower, then you will be happy because you are always going to have more than you expect. He goes on to say, so true is it. What then I say that the fraction of life can be increased in value not so much by increasing your numerator as by lessening your denominator. Nay, unless my algebra deceive me, unity itself divided by 0 will give infinity. Make thy claim of wages a 0 then, thou hast the world under thy feet. To understand Carlyle's point here, we need to do a little basic fraction work. The numerator is the number at the top of the fraction, and it represents what you already have. And the denominator is the number at the bottom of the fraction, which represents what you desire. And so if you increase the numerator, increase what you have, you'll be happy, but only if you increase it to greater than the denominator. And it requires a lot of extra work to get more, or you may not be able to get more. But if you decrease your denominator, in other words, reduce your expectations, then your total sum will end up being greater at the end. And ultimately, any number divided by 0 in math equals infinity. If you make your expectations 0, then your happiness will be infinite. Well did the wisest of our time write, it is only with renunciation, insagen, that life, properly speaking, can be said to begin. So only by renouncing what we expect, by renouncing any kind of material deserts, can we be happy. If we expect nothing, then anything we get will make us happy. If you think your fate is to live in a cardboard box in the street, then living in a small apartment in a bad neighborhood is better than nothing. And then he goes on to practice his renunciation. I asked myself, what is this that ever since earliest years thou hast been fretting and fuming and lamenting and self-tormenting on account of? Say it in a word. It is because thou art not happy, because the thou, sweet gentleman, is not sufficiently honored, nourished, soft-bedded, and lovingly cared for. Foolish soul, what act of legislature was there that thou shouldst be happy? A little while ago thou hadst no right to be at all. What if thou wert born and predestined not to be happy, but to be unhappy? Art thou nothing other than a vulture, then, that fliest through the universe, seeking after somewhat to eat, and shrieking dolefully because carrion enough is not given thee? Close thy Byron, open thy Goethe. Okay, so this is Carlyle's rejection of utilitarianism as a principle. The argument that ultimately we are supposed to pursue our own self-gratification, our own happiness. And he argues that we have no right to be happy. We have no expectation of pleasure or joy. And once we come to recognize that we have no right to pleasure, only then can we actually be happy. He says, there is in man a higher than a love of happiness. He can do without happiness, and instead thereof find blessedness. There is something higher, he says, than happiness, and that's blessedness. So the question is, how does one gain blessedness according to Carlyle? On page 52, he says, but indeed conviction, were it never so excellent, is worthless till it convert itself into conduct. Nay, properly conviction is not possible till then, inasmuch as all speculation is by nature endless, formless, of vortex amid vortices. Only by a felt, indubitable certainty of experience does it find any center to revolve around, and so fashion itself into a system. Most true is it, as a wise man teaches us, that doubt of any sort cannot be removed except by action. On which ground, too, let him who gropes painfully in darkness or uncertain light and prays vehemently that the dawn may ripen into day, lay this other precept well to heart, which to me was of invaluable service. Do the duty which lies nearest thee, which thou knowest to be a duty. Thy second duty will already have become clearer. And so this is Carlyle's doctrine of work, of action, that only by action can we come to some sort of certainty. Choose that thing next to you which seems obvious that needs to be done, and do that thing. And once you've done that thing, you've accomplished something, and it will make it clear what the next thing is that you need to do. For Carlyle, this doctrine of action, of doing something, is the only way that we can manifest the transcendental world into our actual reality. And pursuing materialism will never enact that transcendental world, because we're seeking only for our own self-gratification, for our own pleasure, satisfying the needs of the ego, and thereby will not come to any sort of greater happiness or blessedness. But now I'm going to complicate things a bit, because the question becomes, how does one know when one's work is the right kind of work? And for Carlyle, the answer to that question is, one listens to heroes. Heroes will tell you what to do, and you know heroes because heroes themselves know what to do, and they're doing it. And so if you don't know what to do, find someone who seems to know what to do and ask them. But in practice, his actual demonstration of the right thing surprisingly comes to be based upon a utilitarian standard. Carlyle's actual standard of what seems to be the right thing to do when you look at it in practice is, what is it that will ultimately make people happy and alleviate suffering? And in order to see this, we're going to be looking at a section of past and present. Now, Past and Present is a book-length essay that Carlyle wrote and published, contrasting what he saw as a more vital and alive past, when people used to know what to do and did it without worrying about whether or not they were doing the right thing and constantly rationalizing and analyzing and questioning, and a present which he sees as damaged by this loss of vitality, direction, and action. And in this, he contrasts an historical account of Abbot Samson, who was a simple monk in an abbey and did what he needed to do in order to accomplish what needed to be done, with the present. Now, we're going to be looking at a section from the newer part, from the present portion, talking about the problems of contemporary society in his chapter called The Gospel of Mammonism. And if you remember a previous video lecture, we talked about what the Gospel of Mammonism was. It's the worship of particularly money, but the pursuit of self-interest at the expense of any other people's interest. And in this chapter, he is going to talk about what this pursuit of self-interest has resulted in. And I want you to notice how, in this case, he is criticizing the Gospel of Mammonism because it contributes to the unhappiness of people, which ultimately is a utilitarian standard. He says, "True, it must be owned. We, for the present, with our mammon gospel, have come to strange conclusions. We call it a society, and we go about professing openly the totalist separation, isolation. Our life is not a mutual helpfulness, but rather cloaked under due laws of war, named fair competition and so forth. It is a mutual hostility. We have profoundly forgotten everywhere that cash payment is not the sole relation of human beings. We think, nothing doubting, that it absolves and liquidates all engagements of man. My starving workers, asks the rich mill owner, did I not hire them fairly in the market? Did I not pay them to the last sixpence the sum covenanted for? What have I to do with them more? Verily, mammon worship is a melancholy creed. When Cain for his own behoof had killed Abel, and was questioned, where is thy brother? He too made an answer, am I my brother's keeper? Did I not pay my brother his wages, the thing he merited from me? And so Carlyle is addressing something that he calls the cash nexus. The cash nexus is the laissez-faire belief that the obligation of an employer to employee extends only to the employer paying the employee the contracted wages, and that they have no obligation beyond that. And in fact, they're doing a disservice if they pay a worker more than the going rate. The basic principle, which we'll see lampooned elsewhere in Dickens, is buy in the cheapest market, sell in the dearest. And this implies not only to products, but to labor. Hire workers for the cheapest you possibly can to increase your profits. That's pursuing the gospel of mammonism through the maximization of the cash nexus. And the result of that is that workers are being neglected by their employers, whose only obligation to the worker is to pay them whatever they contracted for. And he goes on to describe how this cash nexus results in suffering. One of Dr. Allison's Scotch facts struck us much. A poor Irish widow, her husband having died in one of the lanes of Edinburgh, went forth with her 3 children, bare of all resource, to solicit help from the charitable establishments of that city. At this charitable establishment, and then at that she was refused, referred from one to the other, and helped by none, till she had exhausted them all, till her strength and heart failed her. She sank down in a typhus fever, died, and infected her lane with fever, so that 17 other persons died of fever there in consequence. The humane physician, that's Dr. Allison who is publishing this study, asks thereupon, as with a heart too full for speaking, would it not have been economy to help this poor widow? She took typhus fever and killed 17 of you. Very curious. The forlorn Irish widow applies to her fellow creatures as if saying, behold, I am sinking. Bear of help, you must help me. I am your sister, bone of your bone. One God made us, you must help me. They answer, no, impossible. Thou art no sister of ours. But she proves her sisterhood. Her typhus fever kills them. They actually were her brothers, though denying it. Had man ever to go lower for proof? For, as indeed was very natural in such a case, all government of the poor by the rich has long ago been given over to supply and demand, laissez-faire and such like, and universally declared to be impossible. You are no sister of ours. What shadow of proof is there? Here are our parchments, our padlocks, proving indisputably our money safes to be ours, and you have no business with them. Depart. It is impossible. Nay, what wouldst thou have us do? Cry indignant readers. Nothing, my friends, till you have got a soul for yourself again. Till then, all things are impossible. Till then, I cannot even bid you buy, as the old Spartans would have done, 2 pence worth of powder and lead, and compendiously shoot to death this poor Irish widow. Even that is impossible for you. Nothing is left but that she prove her sisterhood by dying and infecting you with typhus. 17 of you lying dead will not deny such proof that she was flesh of your flesh, and perhaps some of the living may lay it to heart. Now, the point I want to make about this is that Carlyle, though he is opposing utilitarianism in its guise through the cash nexus and the gospel of mammonism, is actually using a utilitarian standard to judge the ineffectiveness of what he characterizes as utilitarianism. Ultimately, he claims that the neglect of this poor widow led to 17 more people dying. Now, his point, of course, is that that means that she was a fellow human. But also, the pursuit of utilitarianism resulted in greater unhappiness because the widow died and 17 other people died of typhus, and it would have been better, it would have created less suffering had they helped her. So ultimately, Carlyle is relying upon a utilitarian standard based upon whether or not an act creates suffering or alleviates pain as the standard by which he judges this action. And the reason I want to call your attention to this is because when we get to Dickens, when we get to A Christmas Carol, for example, A Christmas Carol is intended to be a criticism of utilitarianism. Scrooge is a utilitarian villain who speaks positively of the workhouse and the poor law and the treadmill. But nevertheless, Dickens' criticism of utilitarianism is ultimately a secular criticism based upon utility. The problem is that it creates more suffering, he says, and that what makes Scrooge redeemed at the end is that ultimately he does basically the most simple Benthamite method of providing happiness. He gives Bob Cratchit food, he keeps Tiny Tim from dying, and he heats up the office with more coal to make Bob Cratchit warm. So ultimately, even though transcendentalism and utilitarianism is ultimately opposed, the only way one can really know the value of an act is through its results, which means all acts ultimately turn out to be judged by a utilitarian standard.